Thank you. It's a real honor to be here. This is the first time I've been to Latvia, and as pointed out in the chair's report, I'm also the youngest member. So in many ways, I want to speak not on behalf of America, but hopefully for a new generation. I think in many ways, someone like myself, who's been an expert on the Middle East and Asia, the question is, why are you in a gathering focused on Russia, the US, and the EU, the new reality? I think this is precisely why we should be having this conversation, because I want to open the scope a little bit, and hopefully my colleagues from Asia will help me as well. But I want to talk about the fact that the new reality we're talking about may not be so new. In fact, it sounds a lot like the old reality. This sounds a lot more like the Cold War than the world that we were promised at some point in time. And so what I'd first point out is that when I think about the 21st century, it's not necessarily a European century. It's an Asian century. I think that you see from the US in terms of in Washington right now, most of the discussions are focused on the so-called pivot or rebalance to Asia. And I think often Europeans get very angry about this concept because they say, if you play basketball like I know Latvia does with your victory, congratulations, you have to pivot from one to the other. So you must be going from Europe to Asia. I would argue that at least in Washington, where I spend most of my time, we're not pivoting from Europe to Asia, we're pivoting from the Middle East to Asia. When you look at the number of troops, when you look at the level of US leadership, we are trying desperately under the Obama administration, whether or not that will continue is a different story in the next set of elections, but we're desperately trying to move towards Asia. We're desperately trying to get into the Asian century. Now, that doesn't mean that we abandon our friends in the Middle East, although many of our Israeli friends tell us otherwise, as we saw with the big debate in the Iran deal. This is a trouble that we all have, the divide between our domestic politics and our foreign policy. I would submit to you, even if we have different points of view as nationalities here, we probably have more commonality sitting around this room than we do sometimes with our own constituencies, the people in our own hometowns, trying to explain it to my grandparents in rural Virginia why we should care about ISIS, the so-called Islamic State in Syria. They say, Joshua, that's not our problem. We're not Muslim. Who cares? This type of mentality is very dangerous. This is what populism does. This is what Donald Trump represents in the United States. Many other leaders from our countries represent this. And so the question for us is, how do we engage? And how do we use a lot of the pessimism that we're hearing to turn it on its head? Sometimes when the world is worst, I think there's a Chinese character that I learned in Japan. The word crisis has opportunity built within it. And in my country, we use this a lot. Don't let a crisis go to waste. So if things are so bad when it comes to our understanding of Ukraine, our understanding of Syria, I would submit to you that as an American, as a policymaker, as someone who watches these things, America has tried every approach in the Middle East. We tried full-scale intervention and unilateral approach in Iraq. It didn't go the way we wanted. We tried a semi-intervention, leading from behind, some called it, in Libya. It didn't go the way we wanted. And then we tried no intervention in Syria, and it's not going the way we wanted. So in some ways, I think people would simply say, this is the price of leadership. This is the price when you set yourself up. And I would argue one of the debates that we're having actively is, how do we bring allies in? And how do we figure out how to neutralize not just threats, but those that we have difference of opinion? We've heard a lot about realpolitik. We've heard a lot about the different approach to these things. How do we move forward on that? I would submit to you that in many ways what we're discussing and what I would argue is my main thesis about our shifting demographics and our economic realities from west to east should not concern our European friends. You know, the fact that we are going to spend more of our time probably talking about the South China Sea in the next couple of weeks because of the Chinese president coming to the US, the fact that there are a lot of discussions about what Asia looks like is actually not a bad thing. In the Middle East in particular, when your country's on the front page, that actually is a bad thing. So I would argue that having a policy on every of these issues as an American is not necessarily a good thing moving forward. I would finally submit, because I want to be quick and short like my other American panelists, because I want to have a discussion and going back and forth. I think a lot of this discussion we're having about the differences of leadership and differences of style gets to a fundamental question. I think there's more commonality in terms of people my generation because we have so much power in our hands. When you think about what the iPhone represents, this is not kind of American power at its best, but it is the largest company in the world. And so the way in which technology is flowing across the world, it's empowering citizens, can be used in a positive way in democratic free market societies. It could also be used to limit ways. The question then becomes, how do we leverage that for the most positive outcome? And I would argue that in many ways, the battlefield that we're seeing this playing out from is kind of in between the western part of Eurasia and the eastern part of Eurasia. When you think about what Muslim fundamentalism, what extremism, what terrorism represents, in many ways, that threat is even more significant outside the Middle East, in Central Asia, in Russia itself. And I think in many ways, we have a common approach that we can use together. And so rather than arguing about our differences, we will always have our differences. There are ways that we can work together on this. And I think in one way is to break out of the old way of thinking. It's easy in some ways to go back and try to find a bad guy. I think in many ways, sometimes in Washington, it's much easier to figure out who is the enemy. If you identify the enemy as the Soviets during the Cold War, and now it's the Chinese, that mentality will lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I would simply urge that even if we have disagreements, like we have in this forum, we're able to have a conversation where we're able to figure out where we can come together on this. And the question of where leadership is coming from, the kind of the retreat of democracy that we've heard in different circles, is something that I would argue is not something that I see in every different generation when I have the opportunity to talk to these groups. Everybody in many ways wants the same things. And it doesn't mean they want the same style of governance. It doesn't mean that they want the same civilizational approaches. The question is, are they able to provide for their family? Is economic stability there? And I would argue that as we look at what's happening right now in the Chinese stock market and other parts of the world, this type of destabilization is actually far more problematic. And the power vacuum in the Middle East that has led to the Islamic State, that has led to intervention in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen by Saudi Arabia, is in many ways a question of leadership. My final comment is basically about the setting that we sit in. I hope that these dice don't represent the way we think about geopolitics, because dice are a game of chance. You roll the dice and whatever happens. I hope it's much more a calculated two-level chess game where you have a domestic and foreign constituency, and we see the commonalities between us at this level. So I look forward to a fruitful discussion into the discussion section. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. It's actually, congratulations, your right time, 10 minutes. But actually, I should ask one question to you, and probably you should give some answer of the complaints about that is a polycentric or monocentric world. And the big complaint is now there is a polycentric world is growing, but still there is a monocentric concentration of all instruments concerning information field, concerning new technology field, concerning finance field. And this makes probably some disappointments and some potential conflictation. Polycentric world is growing, but there is some monopole areas which belongs to USA. What's your answer?
I have to respond on behalf of all of us. I don't disagree with the way you characterize things. All I would simply say is, in many ways, the world that you just described is the 19th century. In many ways, it's a world of empires in which regions become more important. But I would argue, I think as other people have said around the table, the post-World War II environment in which the UN, in which the international order was placed, in which, yes, the US is a privileged place, does not mean that the US will always be in that place. When I think about the kind of very simplistic approach of thinking about the kind of rising populations in India, in which that will become the largest country in the next couple of years or decades, and China with the next largest kind of economy, that should not scare the United States. That should not scare the so-called West. I see a lot more commonalities between the US, the EU, and Russia than I do in other areas. I would simply say I grew up in Japan. Any Japanese that walked into this room and saw a bunch of white people would say, oh, they're all Western. They wouldn't know the difference between a Russian or American or anything else, just like we don't know the difference between a Chinese, a Korean, or Japanese. And so I would simply submit that just because the Japanese have a different style of democracy, or the Koreans have a different approach, or the Chinese or the Russians have a different system, doesn't mean that they can't play in that environment. Now, you can complain about who has that, but what I simply am pointing out that even in the US, we have an active debate about the haves and the have-nots, and what the billionaire class of the 1% versus the 99% is not unique to the international system. And so it's a debate and kind of a revolution that will be ongoing far beyond my country.
Thank you.